Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. There are no flappy flaps on this week's episode because Dave Hone wants to answer a question he gets a lot, and we do get this in our inbox quite a bit, and that is, how do I, not me, not Izzy, but how does one, in general, become a paleontologist? Hello everybody and welcome to Terrible Lizards, and on this week's episode we are not talking about flappy flaps for once.
Or pterosaurs.
I'm confused. I thought flappy flaps were pterosaurs. Was he being rude? This is a family show, Dave. So, we are going to talk about burritos. No, we're going to talk about paleontologists, which are kind of like flappy flaps and they're squawky and they're sort of half dead. No, we're going to talk about paleontology itself, and a question that Dave gets asked pretty much every day.
Hardly, but it comes up constantly, and you see it online all over the place in all kinds of different forums all the time. And even though I've written quite a long essay about this in the past, people seem to keep missing it and then email me anyway. And so, yes, I thought it would be worth dealing with at some length on the podcast.
So the question is, how do I become a paleontologist? In that voice.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I tend to read them, certainly. Apologies to any listeners who are planning on asking me that question soon. It is something that gets asked a hell of a lot, and again, not just of me. You see it absolutely everywhere, time and time and time again. It is a big, big deal. And also, paleontology is an unusual field in the sense that, there are huge numbers of people, particularly younger ones, who are really interested in this. I don't think, I've got some colleagues who are particle physicists. I don't think they get emails from 8-year-olds going, I really want to be a particle physicist when I grow up. I'm sure there are a few, but probably not that many.
See, the thing is, Dave, we're living the dream. I am an author and you are a paleontologist. We have the sort of jobs that kids want to do. I mean, if you're a truck driver, well done. If you have a tractor, well done. If you have an aeroplane, well done. If you're an artist.
Astronaut.
If you're an astronaut, blimey, overachiever, shut up. So, I mean, from an obvious standpoint, most people just go, well, why don't you just do your degree in paleontology? You can start there, surely.
And there indeed is kind of the first big issue, that in the UK at least, it basically doesn't exist. I think the University of Portsmouth has a paleontology degree. To my knowledge, that's the only undergraduate degree in that subject in the UK.
And to put that into context, I think that Oliver Double still runs his degree, his bachelor's degree, in stand-up comedy.
Wow.
I think that's at Norwich University, I'm not sure. But you can still do a degree in stand-up comedy more than you can do a degree in paleontology anyway.
Or at least equal to, yeah. And I don't know my way around Europe, but I have it, every university and every qualification, but I'm not sure they have one there at all. I should also say, before we get into this, obviously I'm talking with a very British-centric view on this, being British and working over here. But I worked in Ireland for a year. I worked in China for 3 years. I worked for Germany for 2 years. I have lots of friends in Canada and the US. I've got colleagues in Brazil and Mexico and South Africa and Korea and Australia, and I've spoken to many of these people about their education systems, particularly with regards to paleo and earth sciences and related things. So although I'm mostly going to be talking about the UK system effectively, the vast majority of what I'm going to say, or I'm planning to say, is more or less true of almost anywhere. I mean, there's obvious caveats, except, the US system has its major and minors and other things like that. But in general, this will hold quite true.
I don't even understand. I've watched so many high school films and seen so much set in the US, but their system is just weird. College doesn't mean A-levels. It's very odd.
No, I know. So that's at least part of the confusion. I guess that there's two sort of separate things to talk about here, ultimately, because as usual, we haven't actually planned this. We're just chatting.
What?
One, I guess, is the kind of classic academic career paleontologist, whether that's that's in a university or in a museum or something similar to that,
like
and how that, basically, but how that typically happens, because I think that's what most people think of as being a paleontologist. And then I also want to talk about those non-standard jobs and routes and, amateurs, for want of a better word, though I think that has its own connotations, but which I mean, not employed in those roles, but also, all the associated and related support staff, whether that's a volunteer on a dig to someone who's a preparator in a museum or an exhibit designer or a photographer or a scientific illustrator and even paleo artist and all these other people as well. And they should not be forgotten and should not be ignored and make valuable and vital contributions and end up on research papers and bloody. But let's even dial back actually before
oh my God,
the
we're going
degree.
back. We go all the way back to primary school, aren't we?
Well, not quite, but
GCSEs? I mean, that sort of level?
I'd say A level. So again, for international people, our final high school exams that you would take at 18 in the UK, you pretty much want to do biology if paleontology is what you really want to do. And then, horrifying that will be to many listeners, I'm sure, maths is probably the best thing to take after that. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I'm an appalling mathematician. I know some colleagues who are appalling mathematicians. If there is one thing which has held me back in my studies and made my life considerably harder to get to where I am today, it is my lack of maths. And I don't just mean arithmetic. I could do that stuff fine. It's the stuff above that, and in particular statistics. And these days also associated with that programming and computer languages. Can't do anything.
See, I had to do Spearman's rank when I was doing my geography.
Spearman rank correlation. That's one of the few things I can do. Spearman rank correlation. I can handle a t-test. Yeah.
But for statistics, you can look at other subjects. For example, geography does have quite a good statistic branch to it. So she says having to do a statistics exam that lasted 3 hours and also do programming that lasted an hour or more just to do writing a program.
I am obviously a bit out of date when it comes to A-level teaching, though an old school friend of mine, Joe. Hi, Joe, because I know you listen occasionally.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah. I'm not sure he's going anywhere with a gun, but not particularly niche reference, so it's going to confuse a few people.
No, it's good. It's good. I mean, Jimi Hendrix is what people come to this podcast for.
Yeah, obviously. Joe is an A-level science teacher in a South London academy group. And yeah, we've talked about these kind of qualifications and what kids are coming through because, he teaches them and effectively they come to me. So knowing, him preparing his students and me preparing for what's coming, we have conversations about this stuff. If you had to pick, those are the two, statistics and biology, I think, are going to be the most important.
What about rocks?
Well, that's the thing, similar to there not really being any paleontology degrees, there is a geology A-level in the UK. I'm pretty sure there's a geology GCSE. It's just very, very few and far between and not many people will coming to it. The good news in that perspective, at least, is that universities are set up for that in the sense that, if you went to try and do a maths degree, having not done maths A-level, A, they won't let you, and B, you'd be absolutely stuffed because you're clearly 2 years behind at least where you need to be in your knowledge base. Whereas when we know it's a subject that isn't taught at A-level, geography would probably help most, I think. But again, although I didn't do a geology degree, I've done some teaching there when I was doing my PhD, and I'm not sure my geography A-level really helped at all in that.
No. You could possibly think about physics and chemistry, maybe, if there's a sort of thing because that's geology effectively as well.
Again, that is useful, but at least that also kind of betrays another central point that I think people miss or don't understand or appreciate, which is why I want to do this kind of thing and get that out there, is almost the different strands of paleontology. So at a certain level, it is a blend of biology and geology. We are looking at ancient animals and plants and microorganisms and all the rest of it, and they were biological things. They respired and moved and grew and reproduced and evolved, and by biomechanics and all those other things will affect them just as they will living animals. On the other hand, they are entombed by and modified by rocks, and understanding the geological history and context of where they were buried, how they manipulated, what changes they underwent, and all the rest of it is very important for interpreting them. And that means you can end up approaching paleontology as a field from one of two really quite different angles. From the perspective as a biologist, which is what I did. We've discussed this before. I did a zoology degree, never done any geology classes at all. But the flip side is you can do a geology degree where they will not teach you very much biology at all and come at it from a geological standpoint, which if you're primarily interested in all those things I was just saying, the formation of the fossil record, dating, we've talked about the taphonomy, so the process of fossilization itself and how things can be manipulated and altered and interpreting that, all that kind of things, then that's a better route. And so immediately, one of the questions I do get as part of this is, well, do I do a biology degree or a geology degree? Because as we said, a paleontology degree basically doesn't exist and you can't really do two. And so it largely depends, what is your background skill set and what are you more interested in?
Also, what's your plan B? Because your plan B is either going to be a vet or an oil baron.
Yeah. In either case, if paleontology is what you really, really want to do, I'm afraid you're going to end up learning quite a lot of stuff you don't particularly care about, depending, of course, exactly what kind of paleontologist you want to be. If you end up doing loads and loads of modules on genetics, which is increasingly normal now for a standard biology degree, and you want to work on dinosaurs, not a lot of genetics going on. Equally, if you really want to cover it from the geology side, sure, the stratigraphy and the volcanology and stuff is going to be very, very interesting and important, but looking at, for example, glaciation may not really come up very much if what you really want to look
Surface
at
runoff
is dinosaurs. Yeah,
soils?
Bits will, but, diamond formation and stuff like this is not going to be that relevant. So be prepared for that is ultimately what I'm saying. Don't go in thinking, I'm doing a biology degree and it's going to be dinosaurs and phylogeny and macroevolution and all this stuff, because it just doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
So you work for Queen Mary.
University of London.
Yeah. And you do courses, mainly you teach zoology though, don't you? You don't actually teach that much about paleontology.
No, surprisingly little, because that's not what many of our students are interested in. So despite the fact that I do dinosaur evolution and ecology and pterosaur flight and stuff like this, I cram some bits into a few lectures. And that's largely what I get in, because we're teaching a mainstream biology course. So in first year, I teach about evolutionary theory and I teach basis of ecology. In second year, I contribute to a giant module that runs across both semesters called, and we changed the name this year, Diversity of Life, where I teach all the vertebrate stuff. I used to have to teach the invertebrate stuff as well. And thank the Lord an invertebrate biologist turned up and took it over. I can do it, but malacostrans and arthropods and ctenophores aren't my greatest subjects, certainly not at a second year level.
I think I said it's a special episode.
yeah, you think wrong. And then third year currently, I teach a course called Professional Skills, and I teach on a field course that we do to South Africa, which is actually about ecology and conservation, and actually because of some of my...
Counting zebra.
Well, some of my ecology background and the fact that I worked at London Zoo, which some people may remember, it meant I spent years working with giraffe and zebra and kudu and a bunch of these other animals, and I know them quite well. So you look at that list and go, that's not very dinosaur-y. No, some of the animal and plant diversity, I teach a couple of lectures on dinosaurs, and some of the examples I use for first year evolution and ecology will be dinosaurian, but there is no Dinosaur 101 with Dr. Hone in first year and dinosaur biology in second year and dinosaur ecology and behaviour in third year. And indeed, you're probably not going to get that almost anywhere.
Hence why we needed this podcast. So this is basically, you've got to treat Terrible Lizard's podcast as though it were like your
bonus university module.
And we leave links to go and do further reading. We do.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, to my blogs mostly.
So you can go away and realise that there's actually some proper reading you should do as well, not just articles. However,
you'll get more out of me than you will at many other universities, because not too many biology departments have a paleontologist on the payroll. And if they do, they're going to teach what they do. And equally in geology, you might go to a geology department and go, there's 3 or 4 paleontologists here. Great. Well, yeah, but if one of them works on trilobites and one of them works on crabs and one of them works on foraminifera, don't expect there to be a module on dinosaur ecology, because they're going to teach their specialist
And equally, there are
subject.
some geology departments that specialise in volcanology. So don't go to those, because you don't want. I know we like a good old boomy mountain, but we don't.
I've published a paper on volcanology. I nearly ended up on a paper looking at Martian volcanoes, which would have been even cooler. But that's
branching out.
We digress
Any
somewhat
dinosaurs
already.
on Mars? We answered the question as if there were dinosaurs on the moon. So yeah.
So yeah, same answer really. Traditional route. So A-levels or, high school, there's much science as you can get in, but preferably biology and maths. Undergraduate degree is really the start. These days in the UK in particular, you need a master's degree to get into a PhD program, to get a doctorate. Not necessarily. I know students who haven't. One of my own students, well, someone that I taught rather than someone who did their research dissertation with me, a few years ago went straight into a PhD.
Now, was that because they managed to get
from
funding?
Undergraduate?
Is that partly it?
No, it's more about the qualifications. Okay. So what a recurring theme which will come up in this is, and we kind of hinted at it at the start, there are lots and lots of people who want to do this. There are not many jobs. Therefore, at every level, things tend to be horribly, unfairly, but fiercely competitive. And that's particularly true of paleontology. It's even more true of very sexy subjects like saber-toothed cats, like dinosaurs, like bird origins, like sharks and things like this. But even just science in general, it is entirely normal to go, I've got funding for a PhD, we can take on a student and 100 people apply. Well, only one person's getting that. So you could be absolutely brilliant, top of your year, top of the class. Well, there might be 5 other people like that who are top of their class at 5 other universities. And then suddenly you're not even making the shortlist for interview. Some of this will be quite depressing. Sorry, but I would rather be slightly depressing and people understood.
And also, remind people how well paid it all is.
Oh, God, don't do it for the money. Just don't.
This is why patreon.com/terrible.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so, a master's degree of some description. There are various kind of master's programs out there. There's a standard MSc, which would be a part-taught component and then a research component. You have MRes, Masters by Research, where it's basically a 1-year research project, so almost like a mini PhD. For those listening in not the UK, an undergraduate degree is standard 3 years, full-time, based entirely around one subject. No majors, no minors, no sports science, no literature, no languages. You just do 3 years of biology. Masters is 1 year, specialising further. So, you might do a biology or zoology undergraduate, and then you might do, an MRes in diversity or an MRes in conservation or an MSc in
evolutionary theory.
Something like that. That sort of stuff until 1 year at masters, and then you're looking for a PhD. And that it's really at that point that you are likely to really specialise and look to do, it's going to be a 3 or 4 year big project on a subject that is going to turn you from something of a generalist into a hyper specialist.
You're going to niche down to answer one very important question.
Well, attempt to, because obviously most of them they fall apart in the first 5 minutes. That's usually what happens.
What was yours on?
It ended up being titled Phylogenetics and Macroevolution of the Archosauromorpha, though my thesis was a bit of a mess for various complicated reasons. Though everyone's thesis is usually a bit of a mess for various complicated reasons. This is normal for PhDs, for anyone listening who's embarking on a PhD or wants to embark on a PhD. They go wrong. They are generally cutting edge. We are putting out an idea and getting you to do some research on something which we don't know which way it's going to do or how doable it actually is.
And you're not allowed to go, we tried this experiment 3 times, it didn't work any of the times, and this is my PhD, thank you.
I've seen theses that aren't too far from that. But yeah, they go wrong. They just do. As von Clausewitz said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. No PhD thesis survives first contact with the actual research. It is very, very normal for 6 months in to scrap it and start again. Or at least not entirely, but, along the lines of we need a total rethink. Or this line of inquiry has turned out to be way more interesting than we thought. We're going to pursue that and not the one we originally planned to. So they tend to, walk around a bit in some rather odd directions and, rarely end up quite how you envisaged them when you started. I think it's very rare that someone ends up with a thesis title, which is what it was at the start 3 years earlier.
Most people I know who've done PhDs lose their minds in the last year. They also have an absolutely terrible time working with the people who are meant to be sort of, steering them in the right direction, who often decide to take on more work just when they're most needed.
Yeah, that's common. Or people vanish. My PhD supervisor, Mike Benton, who's a very famous professor down at Bristol and has written far too many paleontology and dinosaur books. Close to the end of handing in, actually, I went looking for Mike in his office. It was down the corridor from me, and he wasn't in. So I went and asked admin. Mike, I should say at this point, was head of school as well. So he wasn't, he's someone quite senior where people should know where he was. Went and asked the admin office. They didn't know where he was. And his wife worked in the department as well. She was a researcher too. So I went and knocked on his door because everyone knew Mary Benton, and she was, and I'm sure remains lovely. I haven't seen her for a few years now. Said, do you know where Mike is? Because I got this thesis chapter and I'd like him to have a look at it. And, got to hand it in soon. And she said, well, there's nothing in our calendar. And I was woken up by him at about 5 o'clock this morning and he was packing a suitcase and I think he said something about France. That was my knowledge of the location of my PhD supervisor. His wife thought he might have gone to France.
There you go. Not stressful at all.
So and Mike, it should be emphasised, is one of the better ones.
Yes.
But yeah, things like this are fairly normal. You are supposed to be becoming an independent researcher. You are supposed to be being guided rather than shown how to do everything, certainly towards the end of developing those skills. But I don't want to wibble on about what a PhD is, but it is at the end of that you will become Dr. something or other.
Well, we're talking to Dr. David Hone, and I'm just Ms. Izzy Lawrence.
Yes. And from that, it's starting potentially to look for an actual academic position. There are people who have research jobs without degrees. A colleague of mine at Queen Mary doesn't have an undergraduate degree, but does have a PhD. That's a weird way of doing things. It does happen. There are absolutely, I want to say, people who've got into from odd fields. A friend of mine did his master's alongside me. He was 35 and he'd done a history degree. And he decided he didn't like history. He really liked biology. He knew a lot about it. He got on the master's programme. He did great. He got a PhD and now he's a university lecturer in Australia. He's Australian, back in Australia, doing what I'm doing with a history undergraduate degree and coming into the field of biology in his mid-30s. I always recount the story of a colleague of mine, friend of mine. She did her PhD in the next office to me when I was at Bristol. She started, she didn't have A-levels. I think she did A-levels by community college or Open University to get her A-levels in her late 50s. Then did a geology degree at Bristol and then got on the PhD programme. And she was very delighted by getting her bus pass before she got her PhD.
There you go, you see.
So she got her PhD at 67, 68 and then went into a job. So when people, particularly students, go, I'm 23 and I thought I had on this PhD programme and I didn't get it and now I'm never going to be a scientist. And I'm like, Mary got her A-levels at 60. You are not washed up at 21. Let me assure you of this. And those are exceptional, I should say that.
Well, so are people who etch a sketch their life entirely. It's more, I'd say that's more about psychological, I'm prepared to take this leap rather than, and getting a huge amount of debt usually if you're going to go in for that sort of level of, later in life education. That, if you can afford to do it and you can do it, it is possible. I think that's the message that people should have. What are the jobs then? There's obviously jobs at universities where you can, start as a low-level lecturer and that sort of thing, and then hopefully get on projects projects with actual scientists doing actual science with dinosaurs, and you've got to get funding somehow. How does that process work?
Yeah, generally you've got kind of three things that you can go into off the back of a PhD, outside of, inverted commas, the real world. So, you can always go and get a job somewhere else. There are industry parts that take paleontologists, doing paleontology, particularly the oil industry, prepared to look at that. But in general...
They're very happy, those geologists. I've met them. They're very chill. The competition isn't so bad. Yeah. The money's amazing. Yeah.
No, I know. In general, you'd be looking at like something in a museum. And I think people always tend to think of something like the Natural History Museum, with thousands and thousands of people, an enormous thing. There are loads and loads of tiny provincial museums who have one or two, researchers, academic curators who basically run the place and do an awful lot beside that. But those are, for want of a better phrase, academic professional jobs in paleontology. And then, within a classic university setting, there are some weird, research institutes, though we don't really have them in the UK, but, there are some of those out there, but they're kind of universities without teaching. They're still fundamentally academic institutes. Either you can get an academic job, so a university lecturer, or more usually what you'd actually do is get a postdoctoral position. So that is where you or someone else has applied for money and said, I'm going to study this subject. It's going to cost this amount of money in terms of computers and travel and all the rest of it. It's going to cost this amount of money in salary. And we're going to do this job and it will take 2, 3, 4, 5 years and doing this. And you will end up in one of those positions. So I've mentioned, I had 2 postdocs, both of which were funded by the supervisors. That is, they went out and got the money for that project and then hired me. I wrote grants for a postdoc to hire myself effectively, and those didn't come through. But that, both routes are open. So I went to Germany for 2 years and did one project, and then I went to China for 3 years and did another project, and that's when I started getting academic job offers in universities. Short-term contracts, did them for a number of years before I finally got something permanent. That, again, is increasingly common. The time from finishing my PhD to actually starting as a permanent academic member of staff at a university was 9 years.
Ouch.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I moved continent twice, and I moved jobs 4 times, and I had a year where I was largely unemployed.
Amazing. When you are employed as a postdoc, do you have to do things like teaching undergraduates, or is it just the science? Is it
normally a postdoc, or there are special types of postdocs called fellowships, which usually run for a longer period of time, and you're more independent, as in you wouldn't have someone over you. You're your own. Yeah, usually. Though there are some other ones. So obviously, Oxford colleges call their academics fellows, so there's slightly different.
My mum's a fellow of Oxford, just so you know. She's proper clever. I'm a disappointment.
No comment.
Narf.
As a postdoc, you are effectively being told research 9 to 5. What you did as a PhD student, but the idea is that you're not learning anymore. You're supposed to be just doing it. Matt Weddell, my friend who we've mentioned a couple of times, does the SV Pal podcast and sauropod researcher extraordinaire, once said, you only know how to do a PhD when you've done one, or words to that effect. And that's very true. I think that having a PhD proves that you fundamentally know what research is and how to do it. Even if it went horribly wrong and you got no data and no answer to anything, you've learnt that process of being a scientist to a certain degree. And so, a postdoc is almost, right, now you know what you're actually doing, off you go on your own and go and do it.
And try and get somebody to pay you to do it.
Well, yes, even better. And that's what those jobs are. And then from that, and often, again, the transition is into those museum jobs or into an academic role. And as an academic, it will can vary massively by country and institute and all the rest of it. But broadly, depending on quite where you are, you will have some kind of combined job, which means you are teaching undergraduate students, possibly also master's students, and doing your own research. And as part of that, you are probably applying to various different bodies to get funding, to get money, to pay for PhD students, to pay the salaries of postdocs to work under you, to pay for technicians, so people who work in the lab. So if in paleontology, often preparators and things like this, but, for other fields, all kinds of different technical jobs. And, to go to conferences and meetings, and in paleo to go into field work and this, that, and the other, and ultimately, you know, to get that kind of work done at some level. And that's what an academic job really is, combined obviously inevitably with tons of admin for all the teaching and research and all the rest of it.
And undergraduates going, where do I log in for my email, please? I'll just email that to you. He's twitching, everyone. He's twitching.
Yes. So yeah, you know, that's what an academic job really is, and lots of people do that. And in North America in particular, I think that's far less true in Europe. But for the record, you know, a lot of those people are in medical schools because in America you have basically pre-med, so you have a bunch of you know, modules or courses that you need to do to get onto medicine proper. And one of the the big things of that is human anatomy. Okay. And very few doctors are anatomists anymore. The research doctors aren't, because there's not a lot to research on it. And even the ones that are, you know, inverted commas, more normal doctors don't want to be teaching basic human anatomy. But paleontologists, particularly vertebrate paleontology, this is your mainstay. You know, what those bones are and how they orientate and how they work, where the muscles and nerves go is what we do. So actually, when you think about it, it shouldn't be an enormous surprise. And there's, you know, people like Larry Whitmer and David Weishampel and Mike Habib and a bunch of other names that, you know, some of the listeners might know of, basically work in medical schools. That's their address, and that's, inverted commas, their day job when they're teaching. I love
the idea of a really nerdy paleontologist teaching like sports science and like how to throw a ball really well, because you know exactly how the musculature and everything else works and what exercises will actually work. That would be amazing. A paleontologist teaching jocks. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, but nerds and sports. yeah.
I can. But the thing is, when you actually meet athletes and proper professional sporty people, they are really nerdy. Not rugby players so much. They just like being hurt.
I don't know. So one unnamed rugby player has met a friend of mine, or I should say a friend of mine has met an unnamed senior England international with many, many caps and won the World Cup, and said the only thing he could talk about was rugby and was quite tedious on any other subject. And I met an England women's football captain once in a green room when I was doing a TV show, and she appeared to have, as far as I could tell, no interest in football whatsoever.
There we go.
But, you know, that is, you know, inverted commas, the standard route into academia, or one of those kind of major roles. You know, high school qualification, undergraduate degree, master's, PhD, postdoc, and then a job if you're lucky, with, unfortunately, horrific casualties at every single level.
Well, you've made it sound utterly terrible. So what is a sneakier, better route into paleontology? Because obviously, I mean, you've worked with people from all sorts of backgrounds. I mean, we've mentioned graphic designers and the art sort of side of it before. So I'd suggest if you want to know about the art side, we've interviewed loads of artists.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you know, people like, you know, Danielle Dufour, who is not just a paleo artist and scientific illustrator in the sense of that is what she's paid to do, but based in the Royal Ontario Museum. So she's not some kind of freelancer scrabbling for a living. She is paid full-time by the museum to do that kind of stuff. And those jobs are out there too. And that's, the other kind of strand of this.
So do at GCSE and A level, lower, you know, when you're at high school, do biology, obviously, but also do like art and graphics and design.
Well, yeah, and but again, it depends film. What you do. So you know, John Conway, I believe, went and did a biology degree in his 20s because he wanted to know biology better to be better at illustrating dinosaurs. Mark Whitten, you know, the pterosaur guy we mentioned lots of occasions. You know, Mark did his PhD in pterosaurs and had always just been drawing, and has just transitioned into drawing more and, you know, becoming effectively a full-time professional artist in that regard. There are routes that way, but again, at the top end, that usually requires some kind of combination. I can't think of too many people in the dinosaur illustration side, you know, who've got something like an art degree. They've usually, you know, just continued with art that they always enjoyed and were good at and got, you know, more and more and more and better and better. Though there's so Rebecca Gellerenta, who I don't think we've mentioned before and has done some wonderful work and did some beautiful Protoceratops stuff for me. She did there is a scientific illustration masters, I believe, somewhere down in Southern California. I think it's like an hour's north out of LA in some small community college. But like, she has a master's in scientific illustration. You know, those don't come around every day. But there are qualifications in stuff like that.
Yeah, there is anatomy. Like, part of an art degree will include anatomy. Part of an art degree will include technical drawing. So there are different sort of, you know, depending on the subject you go into and who's teaching and what university and institution, there are ways to get qualified in that. Whether it'll help you draw a, you know, Protoceratops, I don't know. But
you know, there are, you know, they're still not that common. But there are professional photographers in museums and universities. There are professional artists and illustrators, in addition to preparators of fossils, people who are fundamentally, you know, field technicians and do most of their work in the field. You know, exhibition designers and scientific communicators and outreach officers, and, you know, even admin people where, you know, a background and technical knowledge. So, you know, we have people in our school at Queen Mary who are there basically to manage and handle grants, so the money coming in and out from various sources. Most of them have a PhD because they actually a real technical knowledge of that subject helps with all of that stuff. So is our school manager has a degree, if not a PhD, in biology. Okay, yes, you're not publishing papers in that regard if you're sitting in an admin office, but the idea that you're not an important part of that work and wouldn't be involved isn't true, and so that's something to emphasise. And if you look at, you know, someone like Darren Tankey, who I don't think we have mentioned, Darren is a fossil preparator. His official job title is something like senior technician at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta. So, like, one of the great dinosaur museums anywhere on the planet, arguably the great dinosaur museum. Darren started working at the Tyrrell before it opened, like when they were still building it.
Wow.
Because you know, they dug up a whole load of local fossils, and then you've got to get them out to put them together to have something to put on the shelves of the museum. So he was doing that work and is still there now. And I don't think I'm giving away any massive secrets. He's due to retire fairly soon. You know, Darren's got a high school diploma. And he has published dozens of research papers because
he's an expert.
Yeah, and he's got involved in that stuff. And has made, not that his other, I'm trying to say this is about to denigrate his other work. He's found a whole bunch of very important fossils. He's prepared a whole bunch of very important fossils. He's mounted a whole bunch of very important fossils. He's a massive communicator. He's written a bunch of books. He gives loads of talks. He's very active on Facebook. He actually runs a Women in Paleontology Facebook group because he noticed that no one else was doing it. So he was going to set one up, if nothing else. You know, really, really good and brilliant for the field in every possible way. But he has also contributed to a whole bunch of papers. You know, the very start of theropod craniofacial biting, combat between big carnivorous dinosaurs, particularly tyrannosaurs, was a piece of work that Darren started on because he'd noticed all these bites on tyrannosaurs and realised that that's probably what they were, and put a paper together on it back in 2000. So yeah, this is the other side of it almost, because I think when people say, how do I become a paleontologist, they mean someone studying and publishing on dinosaurs. But actually, like me in that regard, because my job at university is fundamentally one of a teacher. I'm a lecturer. They want me to teach, and my contract doesn't have the word research in it. It's done evenings and weekends for him, and similar for me. These are contributions almost outside of your working life to a certain degree, and that's another aspect of it that I think people don't get.
But it is important academically. If you just decided you weren't going to write any books and you weren't going to publish any papers and you weren't going to do any SciComm at all, like this podcast, it would not look good for the university. The university are going to want to have somebody who's much, you know, up to date and interested and curious still. So it is kind of, it's like an unwritten rule in academia, as if you're not publishing any papers, you are effectively going backwards.
Well, it can be. I mean, so again, universities...
Certainly in history, anyway.
Well, yeah, but I mean, things have changed in the UK in recent years. 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, everyone had basically the same job title. You were an academic, you were a lecturer, you might be different seniority levels, but everyone officially had the same job, and you teach and research and do some admin. And some people did more teaching, and some people did more research, and some people did more admin. But the idea was you'd do all three and maybe have to take a turn on some of the bigger or nastier jobs. And that sooner or later, some people would settle into more or less just teaching, and some people would settle into more or less just research. And it all kind of worked out. And of course, universities just don't work like that anymore. And so now everything must be categorized and separated. And so, yes, my job title basically, and in theory, at least my contract, fundamentally precludes research. They want me to just do the teaching and admin stuff. And I negotiate as part of that to do outreach and stuff. And I keep my research ticking along. And it's tolerated, frankly, for want of a better word, because, well, but it does feed into the outreach. And in that regard, I'm lucky that I do dinosaurs, because we've definitely talked about this before. If I worked on trilobites, the media would be less interested than when I work on T-Rex and Spinosaurus. I'd probably still want to do it, but I may not get the attention that I do, and that would probably be a bit of an issue. But the fact remains, again, there's a big thing about this, is like, what does success in academia look like? This has been a big thing in, an open discussion. You can find loads of stuff on this in on Twitter and Facebook and places like this, and people say, students thinking, if I haven't got into an academic research position, what was the point of having my PhD? And the truth is, as I say, there's lots of different versions of these jobs and lots of different versions of success. And no, it might not be what you originally set your heart on, and it might not be where you thought you were going to get to, but that doesn't mean you haven't succeeded, and the PhD is a PhD and forever will be, provided you didn't cheat and didn't have it withdrawn like all the German politicians, but that's a separate. For people who don't know, look it up.
It's basically a skill set. Doing a PhD, you're learning a skill set. And if you don't do that for you, ultimately, you're probably not going to be very good at doing a PhD if you're just doing it as a means to an end. So if you're passionate about what you're doing, it's going to be fun, and you're going to do it, and you're going to do it well. And
you're going to get through it when it goes wrong.
If you're doing it because you think it's a stepping stone, it's not going to work for you.
Yeah.
Because there are other ways. Like, for example, me, with my GCSE biology, that is as close to paleontology, and my degree in geography. But I don't have any qualifications at all, as you'll know from listening to this podcast. But I am working, I've got through, the medium of Zoom and other things, but I get to, chat to you because I'm using my skills as an editor and as a brilliant presentary type ladyface.
Well, and a whole bunch of other people as well, because we've had a whole bunch of guests on at various times talking about their speciality. So all of that is in there. So again, when someone says, I want to be a paleontologist, they're probably thinking buried in a museum as a curator researcher, or in a university with a lab and then teaching some students. But all these other things are there, and they require not only different skill sets, as you said, but different qualifications and different levels. Okay, the world has moved on. I don't think there's too many top museums hiring preparators who don't have a biology or geology degree, because that's the way of the world when there's now so many people who are qualified like that. But I also know there are people, a friend of mine did it, start off just volunteering at the Natural History Museum, even fairly recently, as in going in and offering to help out, demonstrated some keenness and some background knowledge on the subject, and worked and built up their knowledge and trust and became better at using the system, and then went off and without a degree, went and got a master's, and has now finished a PhD. So I should say he's not in paleo, but still, and was recently asked to apply for an upcoming curatorship position in their department. So there is someone who, again, started off with a completely, admittedly with a degree, but completely irrelevant degree in arts, and through their knowledge and engagement and enthusiasm and putting the time and effort in, got to the position where they could have been, an academic in the Natural History Museum through that route. So, these things are still possible, and particularly, I think, more so actually in North America, where there are loads of little museums with a handful of people that just cover the local area, where volunteers, those things wouldn't exist without volunteers, and that is an absolute way to get in and be trained up and get that knowledge and experience and skill set. And then when a job appears, well, you've been doing it for 10 years already, even if it's just one weekend a month.
I sort of see it as a bit like stand-up comedy, in that you can work really hard, obsess over it, and basically get qualified enough that enough people want to go see your full-hour shows and everything else. But you can be somebody whose hobby it is, who might run a small comedy club themselves because they feel like it, and they will get into it. There is this sort of element of what do we mean by a paleontologist? If we mean somebody who's looking at fossils, who's helping out with the science, and who's, maybe preparing a bit, maybe doing a bit of digging, maybe just fetching tea for people. It is utterly possible for almost anybody, if you're passionate enough and you're willing to put yourself out there and have the word, no, weirdo, said to you quite a lot.
So absolutely. And in particular, I want to talk about the, kind of inverted commas, true amateurs, as in people working effectively at a professional level with none of those affiliations and support networks. And those people exist. So perhaps the best one, at least within dinosaurs at the moment, is Mike Taylor, who I think we've mentioned before. Mike is the other person who does SV Pal, the sauropod vertebra picture of the week blog with Matt Weddle and Darren Naish. And Mike is a computer programmer and just really got into dinosaurs kind of randomly and reached out and found Matt, and they started chatting, and Mike learned more and more and more and more and more, and then started writing papers. That's it. Anyone can write a scientific paper. The test of the quality is how it goes through peer review and have you done the science right. And with paleontology, I'll be honest, it's a fairly low entry, and I don't mean that to denigrate my own field, but if you've learned some anatomy and you've learned how papers are written and you can identify things, there is countless bits in drawers of countless museums that no one's quite sure what they are sure what they are and haven't bothered to write it down. Formally writing it down and getting that out as a paper is, in the grand scheme of things, compared to most scientific publications in many other fields, fairly easy. And that's effectively what he did. And he's
not even that. If you are prepared to go through and just do data entry and upload all of the information that the Victorians have done, lovely little catalogues, and make it available online, my goodness, would that be popular with a lot. If you say, I will go into your collection.
Well, we have stuff like that. There's the Paleobiology Database, PBDB, online, which is what that is. That stuff's happened. People have crowdsourced data for projects which have then been published and then ended up with 5,000 authors on it, but they're all people who contribute and ended up on the paper as a result. That stuff exists. But yeah, more than Mike Taylor. So Mark Norell, the head paleontologist, or at least head of dinosaurs at the American Museum of Natural History. Mark with Jim Clark. Sorry, Jim's name dropped out of my head. Who's at George Washington University. They were like high school buddies together. They published papers together while they were still in high school. So did Sterling Nesbitt. This is a thing. I know of complete amateurs. There's a guy called Tor Burton. I don't think he's done anything else since, but years and years ago he emailed me before Spinosaurus was Spinosaurus. Wow. This is the early, mid 2000s. When I'd just done my baryonyx tooth paper in China, he emailed me and said, I've always been really interested in Spinosaurs. I've built a complete catalogue of every specimen of any Spinosaur in any museum, anywhere in the world. And he had.
Wow.
And I went, well, go and publish it then. And he mocked a paper together, and it was awful because he'd never tried to do anything like this at all. And I helped him knock it into shape. And I think Eric Buffeteau in Paris did something similar. And he did the lion's share of the work, but I think we gave him a fairly big helping hand, and he submitted it, and it's published, and he's a sole author paper, Bertin 2010, a catalogue of Spinosauridae, and I still cite it to this day, and he's just putting in legwork, even before he knew what he'd done, I think, when he realised he kind of had this data set. I mean, I'm going from memory of 12, 15 years ago now, but this is absolutely a thing, and has been for a very long time. And I've said on plenty of occasions, and I'll say it again here, I think paleontology is not quite unique, but certainly very unusual within the sciences, or indeed academia as a whole, where you can make contributions like this with basically no funding, no formal qualifications, and no affiliations. And there's a handful of others. Archaeology has something similar.
Mm-hmm. If you want to go to a Welsh, hillside and sort through the slag, that is what you do, and you might find a little Iron Age brooch.
and you find stuff. So yeah, paleontology, archaeology, maths, though you pretty much have to be a savant, but there's that guy in Moscow who lives with his mother and won, I think, 2 if not 3 of the $1 million prizes for unsolvable maths problems. But yeah, I think he dropped out of school at like 15. But you can do it. And astronomy, there are still people with telescopes in their back gardens finding, stars and meteors and stuff because there's an awful lot of space and only so many astronomers. But those are largely it.
I don't know. I reckon you could, if you are a zoologist, amateur zoologist or botanist, there's still creatures even in your back garden that might be worth...
True, but finding and identifying them usually requires access to stuff you don't have. That's the difficulty. Yeah. There's supposedly, a new bacteria phylum for almost every gram of soil, but you need gene processing and facilities and a lot of high-end sequencing to do that kind of stuff.
But you could, for example, I think it's not as difficult as you imagine. Yes, you might have to pay a little bit to get access to some of the journals and everything else, but it's not impossible, particularly if you're Googling. You can actually go to the academic directly and just go, can I have a copy of your paper?
Oh, yeah.
I found that you can do that very easily.
Oh, yeah.
And you can also, if you want to talk about the behaviour of a certain... there are ways to do that, and it might not be a formal academic paper. You could write, for example, a sort of really interesting blog, which then, if you send to an academic is interested in it, they might help you write it up. You never know.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that stuff happen. I've contributed to stuff like that. It absolutely is the case. So and that's on the kind of research side of inverted commas, is just kind of true amateurs, but who are still fully published scientists. And then the other side is people finding stuff. Yes, if you live in Manchester, it's, there's not too many dinosaur localities you can start digging at. But, there are huge swathes of stuff in museums around the world where it came from someone who just came across the bones or the skeletons wherever they were looking. And I can't think of anything we've talked about directly off the back of that, but there are huge numbers of them. Vecti Draco, a British pterosaur, really, really weirdly tiny Ashdarchoid, known from a pelvis and part of a vertebral column. Darren Naish, I think was the lead author on it, but certainly one of the contributing authors on it. I always associate with Darren in my mind. And yeah, it was found by like a 6 or 7 year old girl just on the beach. Found this block and went, this looks like bone. And Mum and Dad went, yeah, I think it is bone. And they took it to the museum and went, oh my God, yeah, we want that. Pterosaur pelvis, new species.
Wasn't your hell heron crocodile face, wasn't that a find in Isle of Wight, just randomly?
Yes, I don't know the exact details of those, because in those kind of places there are a lot of professional collectors who are sometimes selling stuff and sometimes keeping stuff and sometimes handing it over or sending it to museums, and that's not a criticism of that. I'm just not sure it's quite the same.
No, it's not the same as the little girls.
But, Steve Etches is perhaps the best example in the UK. If people don't know who Steve Etches is, you need to look up who Steve Etches is. ETCHES. And Steve, we just collected stuff along the south coast forever, had got really into it, had published a whole bunch of papers with stuff he donated to museums and shown to professionals, and basically ended up donating his entire collection to the council, who've now built the Steve Etches Museum to house his lifetime's work of collecting for a country which has been collecting fossils on that strip of rocks where, this is the British southwest coast, Mary Anning, that kind of bit. We've been collecting there for a good long time, and we know how good that stuff is, and there's a lot of people working there, and arguably the Etches collection is the best collection of that stuff. That's the contribution one person can make given time. And so, this hopefully goes back somewhere near to where we started. In the question is, how do I become a paleontologist? Starts with, well, what are you actually interested in, and what do you think a paleontologist is? Because you may not think of it as being a photographer in a studio or someone who just spends their weekends out on a beach, and if they find something nice, they give it to a museum.
Or an idiot who meets her old friend at a party and decides to start a podcast.
And is a scientist communicator now with occasionally some followers, at least 2 of which gave us £1 a month. But that's it. And I really don't mean that in a silly or pretentious way. And obviously in terms of perhaps what you might put on your business card if you aren't affiliated and don't have a PhD might be a bit odd if you wrote Izzy Lawrence paleontologist. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you're not, and I'm not trying to gatekeep, but that doesn't mean you're not contributing to the field and doing something that is part of this bigger whole. And if you treat science as a whole and paleontology as a whole, it is a scientific endeavour. We are trying to learn something about the world and communicate it to our colleagues so that they learn something about the world and so that it goes further out. Then your contribution is valuable,
yes,
as is the people who are pulling stuff out on the beach, as is the photographer and the illustrator and the preparator and the academic.
As is the person listening to this podcast, because they're only listening to it because their kids just got obsessed. And their kids can tell all their friends. And of those, one day, one of them will be naming a type of Ashdarkid after you.
Well, I was going to say they're going to name a dinosaur after this podcast, and the translation of Terrible Lizard would be Dinosaur O.
Yeah. Podcast. What is that in Latin?
Terribilis lizardus.
Wow. That'll be the world gone full circle.
Overall, that's kind of what I wanted to say, I guess, in that there.
So your big answer to the question of what is a paleontologist, how do I be a paleontologist, is to do paleontology. Dave.
Slightly trite and facetious, but yes, not a million miles off either. But again, it's one of the fields where you can do that. You know, if this was the particle physics podcast of CERN, no, unless you've got a job at CERN or unless you've got a job at a university that gives you access to CERN.
Just set up the world's smallest Hadron Collider in a bucket in your kitchen.
Quite, you know, you can't do that. You know, you can't do gene sequencing in your shed, or if you can, you shouldn't. Don't do that, kids. You can't, you know, you can't observe, you know, mating behaviour of condors unless you live in California or Peru or you've got the time to spend all your time there. You can, and I have, write papers where the entire data and origin of that material came from looking up stuff that is already published online. You don't need to leave your desk to produce a data set that is publishable from which you can do, I was going to say real science, playing some of the others isn't science, but I think people know what I'm getting at, you know, to do something even, you know, well beyond what I was talking about in terms of an early catalogue or an anatomical description or an identification, all of which is still incredibly important, and I wouldn't undermine it. I've done a huge amount of that work myself, and I wish more people would do it. But yeah, the idea that A, you can't contribute unless you're an academic, completely wrong, and B, even if you do, you're left with kind of the leftovers and doing these little descriptions. No, that's the starting point, and that's the entry, and it's a good starting point and a good entry. It's well worth pursuing to learn the game, as it were, for want of a better phrase. But again, you know, look at people like Mike Taylor. Started off doing that, then went and got a PhD part-time because he just wanted to, and is still publishing papers like this and is a journal editor and goes to conferences and all those other things that people think of as being a professional academic scientist. And he does all of that, but his day job is his computer programmer. The software engineer. I don't know. We usually only ever talk about sauropods with each other. So I don't know. I don't know what he does, to be quite honest. It's something with computers. We've discussed my technical limitations as it is. But yeah, that is it. Go and do it. But don't email me about it. You've listened to this now.
Exactly. This is going to be the thing. Don't ask Dave. Don't ask Dave what subject you should be doing at school. Just do it. So that is the answer to that question. If you've got any more questions regarding this, maybe ask your therapist. But before you ask Dave. But if you do have questions, please email terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. We will be doing our questions episode in just 2 weeks' time. So you've probably just got enough time to get them in. So do that right away. Also, you can contact us over Patreon. That's patreon.com/terriblelizards. If you are a patron, we'll obviously read and love everything you say and do because you're amazing and you're supporting us. If you want to support us any other way, just share, write a review, realise that you're doing the work of a paleontologist by giving us a good review on your podcast app of choice. I think I can get away with saying that, kind of.
Yeah. Buy my book. That's another good way of
supporting us. No, buy
or
Dave's books.
Me.
Yeah. Buy Dave's books and buy other books by other paleontologists, and buy books which aren't about paleontology that Izzy writes. You can do all of that as well. Find out all about us at terriblelizards.co.uk. And until next week, we will give a big paleontology style, not can I have a cup of tea please, but a massive rawr, I believe. After 3, because we've missed the rawr. It's been squawking all this time. After 3, 1, 2, 3. Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. To support us, please become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. If you can't do that, don't worry. Just leave us an amazing review on your podcast app. Also, you can check us out on Twitter. I am ISZI_LAWRENCE and Dave is DAVE_HONE. You can also check out our books. Dave's got a load of dinosaur ones. I've got a load of children's ones. I also do other podcasts as well. Go to ISZI.com. If you have dinosaur questions, you're going to want to email terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. That way we can answer them in the questions episode. I think that's all I have time to tell you, but thank you if you support the show already. You are amazing. We will see you next time.